Hey, what's up? Todd here, bringing you your Mission Impossible. I apologize slightly for the audio quality, but I'm working out of Philippines with some substandard sort of like audio conditions. But this is so important. I wanted to get out to you as soon as possible. And what I want to talk about today is kind of a new concept. It's kind of actually an old school concept that I'm bringing back in a way. But it's a little bit about how to open and how to hook. And what I want to talk about is a lot of guys, they go in and their idea of opening is go in and self-amuse. And they just talk about whatever you want to talk about, make statements rather than asking questions, and that's all really good advice. Problem is this: when a girl has just met you and doesn't know you, her immediate assumption is that you are the next typical average guy. Now, if you're well-dressed, have a good style, that helps. But you're still not going to set yourself apart so much, generally. So the typical assumption is you're the next average guy. And the next average guy doesn't have that much sex, not that many girls are into him, so that's the place, that's the frame you're coming from. And unless you do something very early on to snap the girl out of that reality and into a different one, you're going to be fighting a very uphill battle. And so while self-amuse, offer value, that's all really good advice. What I noticed that I do myself, having learned structured game, and the reason that I get really good reactions early on that a lot of people don't, is I do something very early on that asserts a frame, okay? It asserts a frame. It asserts that I believe I'm amazing, or it asserts that maybe I think the girl's a little ridiculous, or it asserts some kind of cockiness, or it challenges her in some way. What it basically does is two things. Number one, it gets on her radar. It makes the interaction fundamentally different than other interactions she's having. It's not just a casual, pleasant conversation. It sets itself apart. The second thing it does is it puts you in the crucible. And I guess if I were to call this something, I'd call it like the Crucible Technique, right? Because what you're doing is you're putting her and putting yourself in the crucible. And roughly, I don't even exactly know what a crucible is, but the general idea of a crucible is it's a very hot place where I believe like either metals are forged or something like that is done, but it's this place where there's a lot of pressure and a lot of heat, and something is created from it. And that's what you're essentially doing in the case of this interaction. You're creating heat in the interaction. You're creating an impasse. You're creating tension. You're creating conflict. And so what's going to happen is one of two things. You either assert a frame, and she's going to go along with that frame, and now you're seen as someone of higher value. She's already committed to you, adjusted to you. Or you assert a frame, and she challenges or rejects it, and that's what we call a shit test. And the beautiful thing about a shit test is that when you pass them, that is an honest signal of value. Okay, so what you want to do very early on in the interactions, you want to create this crucible-like situation. You want to create this environment of testing and proving. You don't have to do much. Okay, back in the day of old school pickup, this was the reason why people would do things like negs, right? You walk in and be like, blah, 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 oh, you and I aren't going to get along, blah, 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 and keep talking, right? And you just throw that thing out there, and what have you done? You've set it apart. You've made it fundamentally different from a normal interaction. You've made her want to prove herself to you, or made her want to be like, why would you say that? That was rude. Or who are you to say that? Any of those kind of things. And the key thing here is, yes, you would prefer, the best reaction is you assert your frame and she just goes along with it. That's the ideal. Because then your work is kind of done for you. But you shouldn't care too much if you get a shit test or you get a negative reaction. You should consider that far better than a bland, neutral reaction early on, because it makes the interaction different and set apart, and also gives you an opportunity to set yourself apart. Okay, so that's the key thing I want to impart to you, is that very early on, and by very early on, I mean in the first 30 seconds to a minute of the interaction, okay, very early, you want to do something that's challenging, right? You may notice, if you're watching my infield footage, a lot of the time, what I do is I walk up and I do essentially a mini cold read as the opener. Like, this one is like, oh, I just saw you sitting in the cockiest way that I've ever seen anyone sit. Something like that, which is very challenging, right? It's a very challenging thing to say. It's calling out something about her. It's making her potentially self-conscious. And it's, potentially even like a negative. It could be a negative, it could be a positive. It's a little bit vague. Puts her in her head, gives her something to work with, gives her a reason to treat you as like a source of validation, to treat you as something that's either going to make her feel much better or much worse, right? It puts her on edge a little bit. It gets her attention, and that's what you need to do very early on, okay? So in the first 30 seconds to a minute, do something besides just conversational content. there's the idea, this is another idea, the idea of baseline and plotline. Baseline is the normal conversational content that just is the filler that allows it to be normal for you to do any gamey stuff. And then you have plotline, which is the positive and negative emotional spikes. And what you want to do is have either a big positive or big negative spike very early on. And the positive spike, if you have a positive spike, it has to come from a high value place. And there still has to be a little bit of challenge to it. It can't be like, hi, I love you, and here are my balls on a platter. It can be generally positive, but it needs to be outside of the flow of normal conversation, and it needs to have some kind of flirtation, some kind of challenge, some sort of, again, that crucible element. I really like that term for this, actually, the Crucible Technique, right? You're creating this hot, pressure-filled testing zone for you and the girl, where you're going to find out if you're the real deal and if she's the real deal, right? She gives her that opportunity to test you and that opportunity for you to set yourself apart. So you need to do that as soon as possible. So my suggestion is, when you go out over the next days or weeks, try and just have it in the back of your mind, especially if you have bland interactions, if you have the half-hour conversation where you have that back and forth, and it's pleasant and nice, but nobody's getting laid, nobody's getting kissed, there's no sexual tension. Try within the first 30 seconds to a minute to do something that puts you both in the crucible, all right? So that's the key point. It's something that I noticed I do that a lot of guys don't do because it's just not taught. So now it's taught, you have it, go use it.